Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 73. Have you ever found yourself screaming at the car radio, or perhaps in this case, your podcast player app? Maybe that has happened when listening to this show. I don't know. But it happened to me recently. I was listening to an installment of a well-respected podcast which explored public health messaging. While the episode offered thoughtful insights into trust, risk communication, and policymaking, it included a discussion of autism entirely from the perspectives of professionals and caregivers, without any representation from autistic or otherwise neurodiverse individuals. It felt hollow, a continuation of a troubling pattern. There was no discussion of the neurodiversity movement, the tensions between self-advocates and parent-led organizations, or the widespread opposition to cure prevention narratives among many in the autistic community. In short, the voices of those most affected were left out. I'd like to help change that narrative. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today on Outrage Overload, we're going to explore what it means to have meaningful representation in policy, research, and media. I can't think of anyone better suited to this conversation than Ari Ne'eman. Ari Ne'eman is Assistant Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health. He co-founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, and served as its president for a decade. He was one of President Obama's appointees to the National Council on Disability. He also served as an advisor to the Department of Health and Human Services during both the first Trump and Biden administrations. His work focuses on how public policy impacts people with disabilities, their families, and the people who support them. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it as we unpack what's really at stake in the autism conversation and discover where we can unite around shared goals. Ari Ne'eman, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So in this space, there are a lot of tensions, there are a lot of debate in sort of, especially when we're discussing sort of the approaches to autism. There's a lot of perceptions about the different sides involved. Is it parents versus self-advocates? Is it high support needs versus low support needs individuals? But it seems like the real divide is deeper than that. It's more of a sort of fundamental philosophies and goals about sort of what problem are we trying to solve? Are we trying to reduce autistic traits or improve lives? Are these interventions rooted in real benefit or in social conformity? So maybe you can speak to that a little bit and especially sort of how should we be measuring success?
So, the autism world is full of really intense conflict. And I think it's often very useful to think about, the origins of where different factions and different perspectives in autism come from. Because social movements, they really often emerge in response to very difficult circumstances that people are searching for a solution for. So, when we talk about the autism parent movement, it really has its roots in this horrible libel that was attached to parents of autistic children in the 1950s and 60s. Professionals really, were insisting, this was the received clinical wisdom at the time, that autism was caused by poor parenting. There was this idea called refrigerator mothers. Originated with Leo Kanner, was popularized by Bruno Bettelheim, who was really the Dr. Phil of his day, America's first pop psychiatrist, that said that parents, in particular mothers, cause their child's autism through frigidity. There was actually this movie from the time in which I think Elvis is shown like trying to hug this autistic child to, express warmth, to bring them out of their, withdrawal, which is caused by their parents' frigidity. And, if you know any autistic children, the idea of, suddenly coming up and hugging someone against their will, is really not actually the most accommodating and supportive thing you can do. But the parent movement really developed in response to that, really terrible libel. And because of that, parents were from the very beginning very focused on questions of causation. And this led to a number of problems down the line. The figure in the parent activist movement, Bernie Rimland, who played, a key role in disproving the refrigerator mother theory, also, was disproportionately responsible for popularizing the anti-vaccine stuff that has really played such a, terrible role in, shaping autism politics over subsequent decades. And you can see why that would be, superficially appealing, right? You have this mindset that says, well, okay, the doctors blamed the parents. Now the parents get to blame the doctors. But you also saw really as kind of a holdover from the refrigerator mother approach, this mindset of something has happened to a previously typical child. And the objective of service provision should be to try and recover that previously typical child into a non-autistic child. And that mindset really stuck in the parent world. So there's this very heavy emphasis on causation. There's this very heavy emphasis on cure. Now, contrast that with, the roots of the Autistic Self-Advocacy movement, and the sort of the broader neurodiversity, short for neurological diversity movement, which really emerges in the 1990s and early aughts out of deep frustration among autistic adults who are beginning to come together on the sidelines of parent conferences, in online communities, and eventually in their own groups and convenings, and people in our community, autistic adults, we have this deep sense that we are not being well represented by the standard autism organizations that are predominantly run by parents. And also, many of us, have had very direct and personal experience with kinds of service provision that we experience as abusive because they have such a heavy emphasis on trying to promote typical appearance. So, a common feature in behavioral intervention in autism is, really trying to drill into autistic children making eye contact, or really trying to drill into autistic children having what they refer to as quiet hands. So not engaging in hand flapping, which is a common autistic stimming behavior. Stimming is short for self-stimulation, the thing that many autistic people do for purposes of self-regulation or sensory needs or any number of other reasons, but instead holding one's hand still, not rocking back and forth, any number of other things. These are things that autistic people do naturally. Eye contact is not a especially natural instinct for, most autistic people. Staying very still or having typical mannerisms is not a particularly natural instinct. But this focus in behavioral intervention, which becomes very popular in the autism parent world, beginning in the 1980s, and there's this large and growing provider class called applied behavioral analysis that really is very successful at selling parents on the idea that behavioral intervention can make autistic children normal, indistinguishable from peers. This behavioral intervention is something that we really experience as, very challenging and, really unethical and often very harmful. And so the autistic adult community kind of emerges out of this different trauma, this trauma of, you know, often growing up in the context in which all of the people who are most prominent and powerful among providers, among advocates, among researchers are focused on trying to make autistic people look and act normal. And so the neurodiversity movement really emerges to try and oppose this emphasis on causation and cure. You can really see how, these two movements, both of whom are coming out of, experiences that are quite traumatic, and have in some ways natural responses to that politically, and are building internal cultures that come about very understandably, are headed for confrontation. But I think one of the key things I want to get across here is In fact, there's more common ground than people realize. There's no inevitable reason why parents and self-advocates, or why, families of children with high support needs, and autistic people with less severe impairment, are inevitably destined to be opponents. There are some very real problems that we have to address in the way we approach autism intervention. And I do think we need to make changes. But I don't think the average parent wakes up in the morning and says, I want my child to be normal. I think the average parent wakes up in the morning and says, I want my child to be able to communicate with me. I want my child to be able to live more independently. I want my child to be able to have all of the things that make up the American dream, a job, a house, a relationship. And those things are totally compatible with, in fact, actively encouraged by at least any definition of neurodiversity that I subscribe to and that most of the people I've worked with subscribe to.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the questions I was going to ask too. Is and so I think we can jump there. Is this collaboration has been challenging, and as you note, there probably are, more places for overlap in terms of objectives. So what do you think a more productive advocacy culture looks like?
One of the things that I think is really valuable is to try and, delve into specifics, wherever we can. So one area in which I think there's room for a lot of really positive change is in the autism research agenda. We have a tremendous amount of public funding spent on autism research. In 2020, so this is of course before the current NIH cuts, which we're all very worried about from the Trump administration. But in 2020, the United States spent $418 million on autism research. Only 8.5% of that went towards research on improving the quality of services and supports for autistic people. And only about 4.5% went towards research on the needs of adults. And again, this really reflects a imbalanced research agenda. There's certainly a space for basic research in autism, but autism research, which, came about in large part because of advocacy efforts, was never intended to be a geneticist's full employment act. There's a role for genetic research in autism, but we want to see research that, goes back to the priorities that autistic people and our families have that are most important. Priorities like, improving the quality of educational pedagogy, making it, easier for people to communicate through alternative and augmentative communication, developing interventions that can support independent living skills. If we invested a fraction of what, if we invested 1/10 of what we invest in genetic research into research on communication supports, a lot of autistic people who don't have a means to communicate today would be able to make their perspectives understood. I think that's really important. To take another approach entirely, to kind of shift to another area, when we talk about service provision, so a lot of the modalities of service provision in autism, in particular those associated with behavioral intervention, like applied behavioral analysis, have this very heavy emphasis on what I call clinical passing demands. So a passing demand is when someone tries to pass as something they are not, that's passing. The demand to pass is when society or a workplace or a provider or any number of other sources say, well, okay, we want you to hide the fact that you're Jewish or gay or from a racial or ethnic minority. And, this expectation of trying to suppress the characteristics of marginalized identity is really heavily embedded in a lot of forms of service provision. So if you look at some of the outcome measures that are used to assess whether or not autism interventions work, you very frequently see things like, does the person flap their hands? Does the person have normal prosody or vocal intonations? Does the person make eye contact? Does the person, and this is often in particular for children, stack blocks by color or by size? Well, these are things that are certainly diagnostic of autism. That's correct. If you're trying to make a diagnosis, that's useful information. But when you have an outcome measure that basically says an intervention is more successful if it reduces these traits, and it is less successful if these traits are still there, that's a very big problem. That's where you get something that's really quite unethical. I don't think the average parent wants that. I don't think the average parent is tremendously bothered by the fact that, their kid doesn't make eye contact, except because there are providers who say, well, the path to making it possible for your child to communicate with you or to, succeed in school or in adulthood is by making eye contact. I think those families are often being sold a bill of goods. So we need to have a conversation about the nitty-gritty, the specifics. Let's not get into more arguments online about, oh, you use this word and you should have used that word. Who cares? You can call autistic people, star-bellied sneeches if you like, if it gets someone out of an intervention situation that is abusive, is harmful to them. I'm really, of the perspective that we've made a lot of mistakes, including my own side in, the level of emphasis that's been placed on using the right language rather than putting our focus on changing this flawed service provision culture that has become so dominant in the autism world.
Yeah, we definitely will. Let's circle back to that some more. But since we touched on the language thing, and then we kind of already got your opinion on that, but I just want, it's kind of out there. I just want to spend just a moment about it, because some people, like, this is really important to them. It seems like, or maybe it's not. Maybe that's a misperception, and you can straighten me out on that as well. But there's it seems like autistic adults, according to the research, prefer identity first. I guess you would say autistic person, right? And parents and caregivers apparently prefer this person first language, person with autism. And as you say, we probably should just get over it and not spend a lot of time on this. But how do you think we should approach this? I think you've kind of already told us, but how do you think we should approach this sort of nuanced linguistic landscape?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is a perspective. This is an area where my perspective has kind of evolved over time. And again, it comes out of, I think the conflict comes out of, the various trauma that, different movements have. The origin of person first language actually primarily comes from the world of intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation. And people with intellectual disabilities. And I do use person first language for people with intellectual disabilities because there's a strong preference there. And I believe in talking about people the way they want to be talked about. But people with intellectual disabilities, had this really horrific, and in some ways it's still ongoing, though we've made a lot of progress, experience of being institutionalized, of being intensely dehumanized, such that for the intellectual disability community, both self-advocates and parents, the idea of using language that really emphasized personhood was something that people felt very strongly about. Now, the sort of the foundational trauma for autistic self-advocates, for autistic people, was this push to try and separate the person from the autism. The idea of saying, oh, there's a real normal person underneath the autism, and so autistic people, we really, we gravitated to what came to be known as identity first language. I'm kind of reluctant to claim this, but I think I might have come up with that phrasing. I remember, thinking like something like 15 years ago, we need to call this something, so it's not just not person first language. Identity first language is, like it sounds good because it really emphasizes the aspect of identity, and autism is a part of our identity. I couldn't swear that I coined that. I know other people wrote about it before I did. I'm not going to claim credit, but I definitely remember that thought process. But the point was, it was really coming out of this desire that we had to try and push back against this problematic approach to service provision, this abusive approach to service provision. And I think we thought at some level, certainly I did in that early period, that it was useful to have, an approach to language that kind of matched our goals about how we wanted the service provision system to change, and that we could kind of use it as a shorthand, that the people who used identity first language would be the people on our side. And the people who used person first language would be the people who, weren't willing to listen to autistic people. And so they'd be on the other side. That's not really how it played out. I mean, in my experience, bad actors are extremely good at coming up with, whatever linguistic formulation is necessary in order to put money in their pockets. And so you've ended up with the situation where, yeah, there are a lot of people who have, switched to identity first, who are doing it like for good reasons, and I'm glad they are. I use identity first language by all means, but there are also a lot of people who just, they've switched to the right language, but they haven't changed the way that they're delivering services. They still have the same, abusive model. They still have the same underlying approach, which, I think really harms people. And because people got so caught up in language, they didn't focus on what's happening in the classroom, or in the clinic, or in the home, where services are often delivered in the home. They're not focusing on the actual point of service. And we're still, I think, a lot of families who probably would be very open to our ideas are not hearing them, because their exposure to neurodiversity and self-advocacy is, oh, I used the wrong word to refer to my child, and so someone jumped down my throat on Twitter, or Blue Sky. I guess I'm dating myself by calling it Twitter, but it's there has been so much focus on language and rhetoric, and I think healthy movements focus on the material concerns and the lived experience of people who are in this tremendously vulnerable situation of being in the publicly funded service provision. If you ask me, I think one area in which the neurodiversity movement needs to change is we have to reorient away from language and rhetoric, and we have to place our emphasis far more closely on public policy and service provision practice. And it has to be a movement that lives in the schools and in the legislature and in the various service provision contexts in which autistic people are in, home and community-based services, a whole host of early intervention, a whole host of other contexts. We have to be thinking about how do we push neurodiversity ideas in there. And if we can succeed in doing that, I don't really care what people are saying on social media.
Yeah. Well, especially when it sort of becomes a weapon, like you say, and people sort of stop listening to each other.
And it all feeds into this influencer economy, that we're all struggling to know how to try and connect back to the reality on the ground, right? There is an attention economy where this is kind of the whole thing that you focus on this show, where people do get more attention, and there are various ways that people can turn that into either social currency or in some cases actual currency, in part through outrage. And look, social media mobilization is a tool. I've used it. I used it during my advocacy career quite a bit. By and large, maybe 80-90% of the times, I feel like, we used it well, but it can also be misused. And, frankly, even looking back at my own career, there are, career in advocacy, there are things that I would have done differently, if I had known the ways in which social media culture was going to evolve.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned there, and we've even talked about a little bit earlier, sort of the folks with their hand out ready to take some money, and there's a vulnerability here, and some of it comes from what you were talking about the trauma that parents have seen, and they're looking for recognition. They often, they fall into that idea of sort of blaming themselves, and so they become vulnerable to sort of conspiracy and these false hope narratives. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
So, I think that people have an intense desire, whether you're an autistic person, a parent, or, honestly, if you're a human being, people have an intense desire to be seen. They have a desire for social recognition, that's in some ways almost as intense as their desire for material improvements in their conditions. And a big part of the challenge in countering the nonsense that comes from figures like RFK Jr. is that RFK Jr. offers a sense of social recognition to many families who feel that they do not have recognition in the conversation on autism, and because they feel seen by his rhetoric, they end up not really focusing on actually what policies he's promoting, right? RFK Jr. and the Trump administration have, pushed through Congress the biggest Medicaid cut in history, which I can tell you, in excruciating detail, is going to devastate disability services. It's going to be devastating to the disability services that we like, and devastating to disability services that, folks in other sections of the autism world like, some of which we're not so fond of. But the Medicaid cuts coming from the Trump administration, it's just going to be bad across the board. In some ways, the genius, the terrible genius of Donald Trump and a lot of the people behind him is that he really excels at making people feel seen in a way that makes them not focus on how he's picking their pocket. And I think we're seeing that in the context of RFK Jr. So, okay, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was just starting out as an advocate, ASAN was just founded in 2006, 19 years ago. There was no visibility for autistic adults. If your name wasn't Temple Grandin, there was no visibility for autistic adults. We existed, we were talking to each other. We had these small spaces online and, occasionally some meetups. But, I remember the first big advocacy campaign I ran. We were protesting these ads that the New York University Child Study Center had put out, presenting children with disabilities, including autistic children, as kidnap victims. We talked to a reporter and we said we're an organization run by autistic adults, and the headline was "Parents of Autistic Kids Mad About Ads." It literally could not hear, you're talking to an autistic person. That we were culturally invisible. Flash forward 20 years. Now I think we're a lot more culturally visible. There is a sense, on the part of many families of autistic people with severe impairment, that our cultural visibility has come at the expense of their cultural visibility. There is a sense, that now when people think about autism, they think about people like me rather than, people who can't talk. I think that's probably not as true as they, feel it is in some ways, but I think there is a germ of truth to it. I think there is this underlying challenge that we have to deal with, that we have to find a way to share this cultural space, this social recognition attached to autism, and we have to find a way to share it equitably. And I actually do agree that when it comes to public resources, we should place more of our emphasis and more of the emphasis of policymakers on people with the most severe impairment. I disagree with people like RFK Jr. and some of the other folks who kind of wave the banner of severe autism as to what that looks like, though. I don't think actually people with the most severe impairments benefit from, doubling down on our disproportionate emphasis on causation. I think some of the things being promoted by people who talk about severe autism and how we need to put this emphasis on this idea of severe autism, which is not a framing I use, but it's the framing they use. I really disagree with some of the things that they're promoting regarding bringing back institutionalization, under other guises and placing people in more segregated settings. But that's disagreeing about substance. It's actually not disagreeing about the population. And there are many parents, actually, of kids with quite severe impairments who share our views that we should be fighting for inclusion for all autistic people and all people with severe disabilities and access to the community. So I guess what I'm saying here is I think we do need more cultural recognition and probably even more policy recognition, definitely more policy recognition for those persons with this most severe impairment. But we have a dispute, and it's really a dispute about values and about how we should be approaching policy as to what that looks like. And that's I think where things get really tricky. But at least then we're arguing about, what actually matters.
Yeah, I'm really nervous when RFK comes out, RFK Jr. comes out and says, I'm putting this panel together or this committee or whatever, and we'll have a cure. We'll know the cure or the cause, I should say, the cause of autism by September. I mean, this is one of those things that sounds like, well, if that's your objective, you're going to come up with something by September.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I've said this for the last 20 years, and I'll say it again. It's never been more true than it is now. If someone says they have the answer in autism, they're trying to sell you something. And more often than not, they're trying to sell you something that's harmful and doesn't work. And RFK Jr., who is hand in glove with the sort of pseudoscientific alternative medicine industry, which exploits families out of tens of thousands of dollars and subjects autistic people, especially children, to interventions that are, widely acknowledged as pseudoscientific and harmful, definitely falls into the category of, trying to sell the public on something.
As an example, here's RFK Jr.
This is an individual tragedy as well. Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are children who should not be suffering like this. These are kids who, many of them were fully functional and regressed because of some environmental exposure into autism when they're 2 years old. And these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it.
This narrative that we're doing something to otherwise typical kids in early childhood is false and dangerous. Here's Dr. Peter Hotez, professor and dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine, Baylor College of Medicine, speaking about his interactions with Mr. Kennedy.
I would detail for him the lack of plausibility because autism begins in early fetal brain development through the action of autism genes. And it's not that there's no environmental effects, but they occur early in pregnancy. So, for instance, I would explain to him that if you're pregnant and not aware of it and on an anti-seizure medication called Depakote, also known as valproic acid, that will interact with autism genes to give you an autism phenotype. And I outlined about half a dozen chemical exposures that could be doing it. And at the time, he had no interest because he was fixated on vaccines, and he still doesn't. He refuses to even talk about the role of autism genes. And instead, he wants to push this false narrative that it's otherwise healthy kids who get a vaccine and suddenly they become autistic in the second year of life. And that's not what happens. And yet he continues to push it.
So it's deeply worrisome to me. And I think that is, the essence of, why RFK Jr. is presenting himself as, we're going to find the cause, right? That's not actually, what they're going to do. I think that's not actually what they're interested in. If they were interested in that, they wouldn't be, trying to decimate, more than decimate the NIH budget. What they're interested in doing is, creating this dynamic where they can say, "Oh, we looked into it," and they'll have, a group of people who, come from the fringes of pseudoscience, who they will anoint as experts and say, look at these impressive people who have looked into it for us, and they'll announce, "Oh, it's vaccines." Oh, it's fill in the blank of the many, many questionable autism causation theories that people have been trying to sell families on for the last, 50 years. And it's going to be used to turbocharge quack therapies that will take money out of families' pockets that they cannot afford to lose and that will harm autistic people. It is absolutely snake oil salesmanship of the highest order, and it is truly disturbing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very disturbed by it. It scares the heck out of me. Well, so let's wrap up. We've talked about this a little bit. Let's see if we can go in a more hopeful note. You know, I guess some of it would be maybe it's a two-part question. What are we really looking? Finding some of those shared goals. What do we actually want to change? Maybe one piece would be, what could the neurodiversity movement's message or strategy, what that might look like? Maybe if that was redesigned, and then, maybe we can return to some of those shared goals between autistic people and parents and caregivers, and how we could really align around those.
So, I think about this in the historical context. This partially because I'm in the process of, finishing writing a book on the history of American disability advocacy. So I always think, in terms of, what's come before. But I I I really admire the advocacy culture of the broader developmental disability movement. You might say, Ari, we're talking about autism. What even is a developmental disability? Well, developmental disability really comes out of, the advocacy that, emerged in the 1950s and 60s around what we today call intellectual disability and what we then called mental retardation. And it was actually initially, a parent-driven movement. Today, it's, certainly parents, I think, still play the leadership role, but you have many self-advocates as well, and providers too. But there was this concerted effort to try and build a system of services, and kind of the big breakthrough point there was the election of John F. Kennedy. And, President Kennedy had a sister with an intellectual disability that was actually lobotomized and treated truly horribly by her family. And another one of President Kennedy's sisters, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, really made it a priority to push for federally funded services for people with intellectual disabilities, and really established some crucial legislation on that front. It's actually the last bill that JFK ever signed. And then, of course, president was assassinated, and all of a sudden they went from having the leader of the free world on their side to, suddenly not having the political capability, not having the power to continue to build the system. So there was a meeting of the minds initially between advocates in the intellectual disability world and in the cerebral palsy world. And what they decided to do was to create this concept called developmental disability, which was disabilities, that are expected to last a lifetime, that manifest in childhood. And, eventually autism was included within it, but there was still a separate political, culture surrounding autism advocacy as compared to developmental disability advocacy. But that coalition really mattered because, in time, over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so on, Developmental disability really focused on building a service system to bring people out of institutions and into the community. From 1950 to 2000, funding for intellectual disability services increased by 35 times. That's not 35%. That's 35 times, larger. Is an immensely successful advocacy movement. And the key thing here is it's values driven, is focused on the idea of, okay, how do we, in a very pragmatic way, get people out of institutions? How do we, in a very pragmatic way, get people the support they need to, succeed in the community, to be included with their peers, to be often included in general education classroom, often, included in the workplace. And it actually is pretty focused on people with very severe disabilities. But it does so in this way that really doesn't believe that inclusion and autonomy are incompatible with severe disability. Recognizes that if can't talk, you may need a lot of support to express autonomy. I think about someone I knew, he passed away a number of years ago, named Charlie. And Charlie didn't speak at all, but Charlie's support staff would bring him to different places in the community, and Charlie could make himself understood, by vocalization sometimes, by reaching and touching, like the wheelchair open door, for the building he wanted to go into. Charlie had no language. Charlie couldn't type. Charlie had no way of communicating in words. But Charlie still had the chance to express autonomy because Charlie had services that brought people into his life, that formed a rapport with him, and that he saw as part of their job helping empower Charlie to make some of his own choices, even though Charlie could not say a word. That's a real product of the success of this values driven approach in developmental disability advocacy. So I actually see the future of the neurodiversity movement as really keeping our values critique, keeping our critique, saying these behavioral interventions are harming people. We should not be seeing it as the job of service providers to try and make people look and act normal. That's just not something that's an appropriate province of the educational or medical system. Who are you to say, whether or not someone should be making eye contact? Nobody's hurting anyone by not making eye contact. Let's keep that values-based approach. But let's really try and turn into the realm of shaping service provision. Let's take this approach that says, actually, we should be focusing on people, with severe impairments, disproportionately, not exclusively. Autistic people with a wide variety of different support needs benefit from help and service provision. But there is a need to put the most emphasis, the most attention on people with the greatest support needs. But we can do it in a way that is about empowering services that are consistent with autonomy, consistent with inclusion, and consistent with accepting and respecting people as they are, not as flawed normal people, but as autistic people and as disabled people, because autism is a disability. I very firmly believe that, who deserve access to all of the things that make up the American dream. To me, it's about fighting for the American dream.
And in your opinion, that aligns with both parents and caregivers and the autistic people, right?
I think so. I think so. I think you talk to the average person, on both sides of that divide, what people want is a chance to be included, and what people want is a chance to have access to the same things that everyone else wants. And I don't think there's a deep-seated desire on the part of families to try and produce normal children. I think there are people who tell families that's the path to getting the things that actually matter to you: communication, employment, relationships, for your kid. I don't think it's true. But the way we can reach those families is to provide them with that social recognition and to say, your concerns are real, your frustrations are real, and we want to be there for you as your allies, as your friends. We're not going to lecture to you, but we do think that, we have some insights, and we do think that there are ideas, many of which come from the developmental disability world, which is full of people who are just as disabled as your kid, that can offer real improvement for your family.
That's great. Well, Ari, thank you so much for making time for our show and giving us those insights.
Thank you, David. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Want to dive deeper? Check out my Substack at outrageoverload.substack.com or outrageoverload.net/newsletter for more insights beyond the podcast. Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.